The day the lawyer read my grandfather's will, 15 people laughed. Not quiet laughter, not the polite kind that hides behind a cough. The full, open, leaning back kind. The kind that fills a room the way smoke fills a room, getting into everything. The probate office above the county building in North Ash Ferry, Minnesota, had plank floors and one window, and that laughter bounced off every surface until it sounded like twice the crowd. Hiram Bell from the Mercantile slapped his knee. Silas Creed, the grain agent, leaned to the man beside him and said something low that made them both grin. Two churchwomen shook their heads in unison, as if they had rehearsed it. The county clerk looked at me the way you look at a bird that has flown into a building and does not know how to get out. And behind me, standing so close I could smell the starch in her black dress, Matron Agnes Pike, narrow shoulders, elbows polished to a shine from years of leaning on her desk while deciding the futures of children who had no say in the matter, folded her thin hands, looked down at me, and said, "Caleb Voss, even your dead kin could not leave you land fit for a grave." I was 16 years old. My father, Ansel Voss, had drowned breaking spring ice on the Red Lake River when I was 8. My mother, Mara, died of lung fever the following winter after taking washing from railroad men. She coughed for 6 weeks. I counted every one. After that, I was passed along the way. You pass along a tool nobody wants, but nobody throws away. 3 months with Aunt Lenora, who sent me back after I corrected her husband's arithmetic in front of company. 11 months with the Benson farm family, who wanted my back for hauling but had no use for my name. 6 weeks with Widow Klein, who found my habit of reading by candlelight disturbing and wasteful and said boys who read after dark invited wickedness. Then the county children's ward, where I learned to keep my face still and my hands where people could see them. I had 42 cents, a tin cup, one spare shirt, and a school primer I had stolen from the ward library. That was everything. The lawyer read the deed. My grandfather, a man I had never met, a man the town remembered only as a fool with a fixation on swampland, had left me 41 acres of frozen peat bog on the south edge of Tamarack Fen. No timber, no plowable ground, no house worth taxing. 12 miles east of the Red River line and 6 miles from the nearest wagon road. The town called it Voss's Drowning Mattress. It was black water, brown sedge, standing ice in winter, black flies in summer, and not one tree thicker than a broom handle. My grandfather had paid $3 and a cracked mule harness for it in 1862, and in 23 years of owning it, he had earned nothing from it but a reputation as a man who had lost his mind to a swamp. He died frozen beside his own equipment in 1881. That was my inheritance. 41 acres of land that could not grow wheat, could not hold cattle, could not keep a man alive, and could not even bury one properly. Every person in that room understood why they were laughing. I understood too. But something caught in me when the lawyer said the word bog, a sound from years back, my mother warming her hands over a low fire, whispering something she had learned from her own people. A bog remembers the sun. I did not understand what it meant. I still heard her voice saying it, and something in my chest turned over, the way an engine turns over before it catches, and I did not laugh. If you want to find out what I did with 41 acres of frozen swamp in northern Minnesota, how a 16-year-old orphan with 42 cents and a stolen book turned a piece of ground the whole town called a drowning mattress into something that held 23 lives steady on the worst night in 50 years, then subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Because what that dead swamp was hiding under its black water, what I pulled from the ground and built with my own cracked hands, is a story those people in that probate room are still telling their grandchildren today. I left the county office 2 days later. Agnes Pike did not try to stop me. She handed me the deed the way you hand a child a spoon that is too hot. Quickly, at arm's length, with no intention of being blamed for whatever happens next. The road north out of North Ash Ferry was frozen hard for the first 4 miles. Wagon ruts cut deep enough to twist an ankle. I walked on the ridges between them, my bundle over one shoulder, the deed folded inside my coat against my chest. I had 42 cents, a tin cup, 1 spare shirt, and a school primer I had stolen from the county ward library. I mention the stealing because it matters, not to my soul, to my survival. That primer was the only book I owned, and it had taught me to read well enough to understand what came next. The road got worse after the Lindgren homestead. The ruts softened into wagon scars, then the scars faded into deer track, and the deer track wandered between stands of birch so thin they looked embarrassed. The last real trees I saw were along the river, ash and elm, most of them already cut to stumps. Beyond that, the land opened up flat and wet and endless. Sky above, sedge below, wind from every direction at once with nothing to stop it. I smelled tamarack fen before I saw it. Cold iron and wet rot and something sour underneath, like old tea left in a pot all winter. The ground changed under my feet. Frozen crust gave way to a surface that pushed back when you stepped on it, as if the earth were breathing and did not appreciate the weight. My shoes soaked through where the ice thinned. Then I saw it. 41 acres of tamarack fen looked exactly like a place where hope went to drown. Black water stood in patches between low brown hummocks. The sedge was bent flat by wind that had been blowing since before anyone thought to name this county. There were no trees thicker than a broom handle, just scattered tamaracks, bare and crooked, growing at angles that suggested they had been trying to leave for decades. The sky reflected white off the standing water, and if you squinted, you could not tell where the land ended and the air began. The only structure was a collapsed willow shack leaning hard to the south. One wall gone entirely. The roof sagged in the middle like a horse that had given up. A rusted stove sat inside with its belly split open. I could see through the crack to the ground beneath it. Frogs jumped off the threshold when I approached, which struck me as both funny and terrible, because even the frogs did not want to be caught living there. I stood in the doorway of that shack and thought, every person who laughed in that courtroom was right. This was not land. This was a punishment someone had wrapped in a deed. I had walked 7 miles. I had nowhere to go back to, and I had no firewood. That last fact settled over me slowly, the way real danger often does. Not firewood, as in not much firewood. Firewood, as in none. The tamaracks were too thin and too green. The willow was rotten. I broke dead switches from the brush and tried to burn them in the split stove. They smoked like wet hair and gave off less heat than my own breath. I fed the fire for an hour, and it never once flickered above ankle height. My first night on Tamarack Fen, I slept under the collapsed half of the roof with my knees pulled to my chest and my coat buttoned to my throat. The temperature dropped hard after dark. Ice formed in the standing water and made sounds, small cracks like someone stepping carefully toward me. I did not sleep so much as pass in and out of consciousness while my body shook. I was 16 years old. I owned 41 acres. I could not make fire. The next morning, I was looking for anything dry enough to burn when I found the bench. It was a peat cutting bench, which I did not recognize at the time. It sat against the one standing wall of the shack, half buried in fallen thatch. Heavy. Oak, or something close to it, darkened with age and bog damp. One leg was thicker than the others, and when I kicked it, not out of cleverness, out of frustration, something shifted inside. The leg was hollow. Beneath a warped board at its base, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with tarred cord, was a bundle the size of a family Bible. I cut the cord with a rusted knife I found in the stove ash. Inside the oilcloth were 16 notebooks. They were small, each one no bigger than my hand spread wide, and they were numbered on their covers in a careful, slanted script. The pages were stiff with age, but readable. Beside the notebooks lay a rusted peat knife with a handle worn smooth by decades of grip, a hand-drawn map of the bog folded into quarters, and one envelope. The envelope was addressed, "For Caleb, if they ever let him come." I did not open it, not yet. My hands were shaking, and not from cold. I sat on the frozen ground beside that bench and held the envelope against my chest the way you hold something that might be the last kind thing anyone ever does for you, because you are not sure yet whether it is real. The notebooks were written by Elias Ward Voss, my mother's father, the man who had bought this land for $3 and a cracked mule harness in 1862, the man the town called crazy, the man who died frozen beside his own drying racks in 1881, 4 years before I stood in his ruined shack, holding his life's work in my numb fingers. I opened Notebook 1. I read by weak daylight because I had no lamp oil and nothing to put it in if I had. Elias's handwriting was small and tilted, but steady. These were not the scrawls of a madman. They were the records of a man who had spent 23 years paying attention to a piece of ground that no one else would look at twice. Notebook 1 was a map of the bog, not just the surface, the depths. Elias had pushed willow poles into the peat at intervals of 50 feet across the entire fen and recorded how far they sank before hitting clay. The western edge was shallow, 4 feet. The center ran to 11. The southeast corner, near a low rise he called the hummock, was 8 feet of dense, black, well-decomposed peat sitting on a bed of river clay. Notebook 3 was about cutting. June 9, 1864, he wrote. Lower black layer cuts clean and dries harder than upper moss. Upper moss crumbles. Lower black holds shape. This is the layer. He had drawn diagrams of brick sizes, 12 inches by 6 by 4, and noted drying times by season. Summer bricks dried in 18 days if turned twice. Autumn bricks took 30 or more. Notebook 7 was where things changed. October 3, 1868, Elias wrote. Wall of 2 feet holds wind but not cold. I have been a fool about thickness. Measured interior this morning at 14 degrees while exterior stood at 6 below. 2 feet is not shelter. 2 feet is vanity. 4 years later, Notebook 11. January 18, 1872. 3 feet is the measure, less is pride. 3 feet is shelter. He had recorded the interior temperature of a test wall, just a wall, not even a room, at 38 degrees above zero, while the outside air sat at 22 below. 3 feet of dried peat block, plastered inside with river clay, held warmth the way a stone holds the heat of a summer day. He was not digging a swamp. He was mining insulation. He was mining fuel. He was building a house out of the ground itself, walls and heat from the same material, cut from land everyone said could not grow wheat. I understood then what my mother had meant. A bog remembers the sun. Peat is centuries of plants, compressed and preserved in wet, airless ground. When you dry it and burn it, you are releasing the heat those plants captured from sunlight 1,000 years ago. When you stack it thick and plaster it, you are wrapping yourself in a wall that will not let that heat escape. My grandfather had figured this out alone, with willow poles and a knife and 2 decades of patience, and the entire town had called him mad for it. I opened the envelope. Elias wrote that he knew Mara's boy might someday be told he came from nothing. He wrote that the county might try to keep the boy from the fen. He wrote that the town would say the land was cursed or worthless, or both. And then he wrote the line that broke me open. What looks dead in summer may be holding winter's fire. I sat on the dirt floor of that collapsed shack and cried. Not quiet crying, the kind that bends you forward and makes sounds you did not know you could make. I cried because a man I had never met had spent 23 years preparing for me. I cried because he had written my name on an envelope and wrapped it in oilcloth against the damp, believing that someday I would find it. I cried because my mother had told me about bogs, and I had thought it was just a story she told to warm herself, and it turned out it was a map. When I stopped, I said it out loud. Not to anyone. To the shack, and the notebooks, and the frozen fen outside. I will finish the 3-foot wall. It sounded absurd. I had no peat spade. I had no stone for a hearth. I had no food, no lamp, no help, and no idea whether a 16-year-old boy with stolen books and 42 cents could cut a single usable brick from a frozen bog. But Elias's notebooks assumed I would try. They assumed I had tools, food, and time. I had none of those things, but I had the notebooks, and the notebooks assumed me. 3 days later, I walked to Bell's Mercantile in North Ash Ferry to buy a cheap file for sharpening the peat knife. Hiram Bell stood behind the counter. He was a wide man with a red beard trimmed to a square, and he looked at me the way you look at a dog that has wandered somewhere it should not be. "What are you filing?" he asked. "A peat knife," I said. "What for?" "Cuttin' peat." Hiram laughed. Not cruelty exactly, more like reflex. "You cannot warm a house with swamp dirt, boy." I paid the 8 cents for the file and walked back to the fen. 7 miles. My shoes were already falling apart, but I carried the file like it was worth more than the 41 acres, because without it, the peat knife was a dull piece of rust, and without the peat knife, the notebooks were just a dead man's diary. I nearly died before I built anything. Autumn came in fast that year. 1885 in northwest Minnesota did not ease you into cold, it hit. The first hard frost came in early October, and by the end of the month, the standing water on the fen was frozen solid. I had patched the shack roof with sedge bundles and plugged the wall gap with packed mud, but wind still found every seam. On bad nights, frost formed on the inside of the walls. Food was the real problem. I trapped muskrats, badly. The first 2 I caught, I ruined one hide trying to skin it in the dark. I ate cattail roots until my stomach cramped so hard I could not stand straight. I tried burning wet peat for warmth and filled the shack with smoke so thick and sour that I crawled outside and lay on the frozen ground, coughing, until I could breathe again. That was not a low point. That was an average Tuesday. My hand split open from reaching into cold water. The cracks bled, and the blood froze on my knuckles, and I learned that frozen blood is surprisingly hard to wash off. My weight dropped. I punched a new hole in my belt with the tip of the peat knife, and when that hole was too loose 3 weeks later, I punched another. My ribs showed through my shirt. One night in November, freezing rain came through the roof gap and soaked my blanket. I lay there shaking, listening to ice tick against the sedge, and I decided to walk back to the county ward in the morning. Agnes Pike would take me back. She would say something cutting and precise about swamp dirt and dead grandfathers, and I would stand there and take it, and at least I would be warm. I got up before dawn and wrapped the notebooks in their oilcloth to keep them safe for whoever came next, and as I tied the cord, Notebook 14 fell open to a page near the middle, Elias's failure log. Page after page, the same word: failed, failed wall, failed chimney, failed seal, failed draft. 23 years of entries, and the failures filled an entire notebook. But the entries kept going. Each failure was followed by a measurement. Wall cracked at joint, mortar too wet, Next attempt, drier mix, narrower seam. Chimney drew smoke back inside. Throat too wide, reduce by half. Roof thatch failed in November gale, needs steeper pitch and heavier reed. One line stopped me. A failed wall still teaches if a man is humble enough to measure it. I unwrapped the notebooks. I put them back under the bench. I stayed. The land kept me alive, but only just. Cattail flower, frozen cranberries I found under sedge near the creek, muskrat when I could trap it. A trapper named Gustafson came through in December and traded me a sack of oats, moldy but edible, for 2 hours of patching his sled runners. Those oats lasted 3 weeks. I measured them in handfuls and ate them half cooked because I could not keep the willow fire going long enough to boil water properly. By the time the ground began to soften in March, I'd lost more weight than I cared to guess. My hands were scarred from cold cracks. My knees ached from sleeping on frozen dirt. But I was alive, and the notebooks were dry, and when the ice pulled back from the southeastern edge of the fen, I could see the black seam Elias had marked on his map, exposed and dark as coffee grounds along the waterline. I had survived the winter, but I had not built anything. I had not cut a single brick, and the next winter was already less than 8 months away. Spring in a Minnesota peatland is not spring the way most people use that word. It is mud. Mud to your knees, mud in your shoes, mud on every surface you touch, mud that smells of 10,000 years of dead plants slowly becoming something else. The fen flooded with snow melt and stayed flooded through April. I watched from the hummock, the one dry rise on the property, and waited for the water to drop enough to reach the black seam. In May, it dropped. I waded in. Elias's map was exact. The lower seam sat about 3 feet below the surface on the southeast side, and when I pushed the sharpened peat knife into it, the blade sank smooth and steady, like cutting dense wet bread. The peat was black and heavy, and held together when I lifted it. I cut my first brick crooked, too thick on one end, thin on the other, and it weighed close to 30 pounds wet. I carried it to the hummock and set it on a patch of dry sedge to begin drying. It took me 4 hours to cut 10 bricks. My arms shook, my back seized. The bog water was cold enough to numb my feet by mid-morning, and by afternoon, I was stumbling on the uneven bottom. Each brick had to be lifted from waist-deep water, carried to the hummock, and set level with space for air to circulate. Elias's notebook said to use drying racks, raised willow frames that let wind pass under and over the bricks. I had no racks. I laid bricks on sedge and hoped. By the end of the first week, I had 30 usable bricks and a back that woke me every time I rolled over. Half the bricks I cut crumbled before they dried. Too much moss, not enough of the dense lower layer. Elias had written, "Lower black layer cuts clean," and he was right, but finding that layer meant standing in thigh-deep water and feeling with the knife tip for the change in density. Some days I cut for 3 hours and pulled up nothing but stringy brown mush. I built drying racks from willow poles lashed with strips of cattail leaf. The first rack collapsed after 4 days. The second held. By the end of the third week, I had 112 bricks drying on 2 racks and on flat ground, and a system that was slow but working. Elias's plan called for over 1,000 bricks for a proper 3-foot wall house. At my pace, that was months. Then June brought rain. 3 days of steady downpour soaked every brick I had dried. I stood in the rain watching weeks of labor turn soft and dark again, and I screamed at the sky. It was not dignified. It was the sound of a boy who had carried 30-pound bricks through waist-deep water for a month and was watching them dissolve. Nobody heard me except the frogs, and they did not care. I spent 2 days restacking every surviving brick with reed spacers between them so air could move freely on all sides. 63 bricks survived. 49 were lost. I learned something Elias had not written clearly enough. Wind matters more than sun. The bricks that faced the prevailing northwest wind dried twice as fast and held their shape. I rebuilt the racks angled to catch the wind and started again. By August, I had 214 bricks on 4 racks, and the oldest ones were finally hard. I picked up one that had been drying for 9 weeks and struck it against another. The sound it made was sharp and clean, a knock like knuckles on dry oak. I held it to my nose. It smelled like earth and distance and cold mornings. I shaved a curl from its edge with the peat knife and lit it in the broken stove. The flame caught slowly, blue at the edges, then orange, then a steady burn that did not flicker or spit. I held my hands over it and felt heat, real heat, the kind that sinks into your bones and stays. That one shave-in burned longer than a handful of willow twigs. I sat beside the stove and watched it, and I whispered it like a prayer. He was right. That was the day Orrin Mickelson appeared. I did not hear him coming. I smelled smoke from the stove and was watching the flame when a voice behind me said, "That chimney will kill you before winter if you keep drawing smoke through a cracked belly." I grabbed the peat knife and spun around. An old man stood at the edge of the shack. He was tall and thin and stooped, leaning on a willow cane, wearing a coat too big for him. His face was brown and creased like a walnut, and his hands, I noticed them because of what they would later teach me, were enormous, knuckled and scarred, with fingers that curved slightly inward, as if they were still gripping tools even at rest. He raised both hands, palms open. "Easy, boy. I am not here to take anything." "Who are you?" I asked. "Orrin Mickelson," he said. "I knew your grandfather. Played checkers with him beside this bog when he was the only man in the county willing to sit in mud and talk about heat. I helped him haul the first stones for the hearth he never finished." He looked at the peat shavings still burning in the stove. He looked at the drying racks on the hummock. He looked at the notebook spread open on the bench. "Your grandfather was not mad, boy," he said. "He was early. Orrin told me he had seen my smoke from the old freight road and recognized it. Not wood smoke, peat smoke. A different color, a different weight in the air. He said he had not smelled it since Elias died, and it drew him the way a church bell draws a man who has not prayed in years. He did not ask if I needed help. He walked to the drying racks, picked up a brick, turned it in his hands, and said, 'Too thick on the east side, and you need racks 2 feet higher or the ground damp will slow you by a week.' I could have been angry. I was not. I was so grateful for another human voice that I nearly sat down in the mud. Orrin became my teacher that afternoon, and I did not know yet how little time we would have. Chunk 2 continues. Orrin Mickelson was 71 years old the summer he walked into my bog. His knees were bad. His left hand trembled when he held it still, though it steadied the moment he picked up a tool. He could not lift much, but his eye was the most precise instrument I have ever encountered in another human being. He came back the next morning with a draw knife, a plumb line, and a canvas sack of river stones he had carried 2 miles on his back. He set the stones beside the shack and said, "Show me the notebooks." I showed him. He read slowly, turning pages with a thick finger, nodding at some entries, frowning at others. When he reached notebook 7, the wall thickness experiments, he tapped the page and said, "This is where Elias and I argued. He wanted 2 feet. I told him 2 feet was nothing but a windbreak with ambition. He did not speak to me for a month." "He came to 3 feet, I said. "He did." Orrin closed the notebook. 4 years later. "Your grandfather was stubborn in the way that rivers are stubborn. He did not go around a thing. He went through it. Slowly. I asked him why he was helping me. He could have stayed home. He could have let the boy in the bog fail quietly, the way the town expected. Orrin looked out at the drying racks and the black water beyond them. Because Elias built for people who laughed at him, he said, and that is the sort of mind worth standing beside. He told me about his wife, Brita. She had frozen during a windstorm in 1879 while Orrin was away hauling freight on the river. Their cabin had wood walls, but the chinking between the logs had cracked during a cold snap, and the wind came through the gaps like water through a sieve. Britta was dead before the neighbors found her. Orrin said it plainly, without decoration, the way a man describes something he has carried for so long it has worn smooth. Wood walls, he said. Everyone trusts wood. Wood fails. That was the day Orrin began teaching me stone. He showed me how to choose river stones, flat on two sides, dense, without cracks that would split in heat. He showed me how to mix clay with sand and straw until it held a thumbprint without crumbling. He showed me how a hearth must stand away from a peat wall with a clay-plastered shield between flame and fuel, because peat will burn if you give it reason. He showed me how a chimney needs a throat, a narrowing above the firebox that pulls smoke upward instead of letting it wander back into the room. His hands trembled when they were empty. When they held a stone or a trowel, they were as steady as the day he laid his first hearth 40 years before. I learned more from watching those hands than from reading any of Elias's notebooks. The notebooks told me what to build. Orrin showed me how. But Orrin was slow. He rested often. He coughed in the mornings and could not straighten his back fully after bending. Some days he arrived late and left early, and I could see the walk had cost him more than he would say. I was learning from a man whose body was running out of time, and both of us knew it, and neither of us said it aloud. The Black House began in August of 1886. I chose the highest point on the hummock, a rectangle 12 feet by 14 feet, raised above the bog's flood line by nearly 3 feet of solid ground. Orrin insisted we dig drainage trenches first, cutting shallow channels away from the foundation on 3 sides so spring melt would run off instead of pooling against the walls. We laid river stones for a dry sill, 2 courses deep, leveled with the plumb line Orrin had carried from his dead wife's cabin. The walls went up brick by brick, 3 feet thick, just as Elias had measured. Outer course of dried peat blocks laid like masonry, staggered at the joints. A packed layer of reed and sedge in the middle for drainage. Inner course of peat, then a skim of clay plaster to seal the surface and keep the dust down. Each block weighed between 15 and 20 pounds dry. Each course required over 60 blocks. The walls would stand 7 feet high, which meant roughly 12 courses, which meant more than 700 blocks for the walls alone. And that did not count the ones that cracked, or the ones I dropped, or the ones that crumbled because I had pulled them from the racks a week too early. By September, 1 wall stood shoulder high. By October, 3 walls and the stone hearth base. I was cutting 500 bricks a week by then. Orrin had shown me a faster method, angling the knife to use the peat's own weight to separate each brick from the seam below. My hands had gone past blistering into something else. The skin on my palms was thick and yellow and cracked at the knuckles, and I stopped noticing the pain the way you stop noticing a clock ticking in a room you have lived in long enough. Orrin built the hearth. It took him 3 weeks. He selected every stone himself, rejecting 9 out of 10 for invisible flaws. The firebox was lined with the densest river rock he could find, and the smoke shelf, a flat stone angled above the fire, to direct smoke upward. He fitted so precisely that I could not slide a blade between the joints. The chimney rose through the roof on a base of stacked stone, clay mortared and plastered inside and out. Orrin insisted on a low entry tunnel on the east wall instead of a door facing north. North Wind is a thief that likes doors, he said. Make it crawl. By the first hard frost, we had roof poles, driftwood salvaged from the river, dragged 3 miles across the fen on a sledge Orrin helped me build from willow and rawhide. Reed thatch over the poles, layered thick and tied with cattail cord. A smoke hole capped with tin from a ruined trunk I found half buried near the old shack. I had cut more than 1,400 bricks and ruined close to 300 learning. My body was a record of the work, black nails from dropped stones, raw palms even through the calluses, peat dust in my nose that I blew out brown every morning, knees swollen from hours in bog water, shoulders that ached so badly I woke every time I turned in the night. In late October, Hiram Bell rode out from town. He said he had come to collect an old flour debt, the sack I had bought on promise when the oats ran out, but I think he came to look. He stood at the edge of the hummock and stared at the walls. "What is that?" he asked. "A house," I said. "Made of what?" "Peat." He walked around it. He touched the wall, then pulled his hand back. "Looks like a grave with a door," he said. "Then it will be the warmest grave in Minnesota," I told him. Hiram did not laugh. He did not nod. He said, "I will not extend credit to a boy living in swamp mud," and he left. But 3 days later, his wife Ruth left a bundle on the path near the hummock, bent nails, a cracked kettle, and a sack of barley, without a note. I knew Hiram had not approved. I used the nails for the door frame. November came hard. Wind flattened the sedge across the fen and drove sleet sideways for 3 days straight. I sealed the entry tunnel, banked the hearth with dried peat, and lit the fire. The black house held. I pressed my hand to the inner wall and felt warmth. Not heat. Warmth. Steady even, radiating from 3 feet of dense peat that had spent all summer baking in the wind. The clay plaster was dry to the touch. The fire burned low and slow, feeding on bricks that Elias had taught me to cut and Orrin had taught me to stack. I checked the thermometer Orrin had brought from his cabin. 54 degrees inside. Outside, the wind was driving ice crystals hard enough to sting exposed skin. I logged the number in Elias's notebook, $16, the one he had left blank, as if he knew someone would need to continue the record. 54 degrees. The first proof that 23 years of a dead man's patience and 1 summer of a boy's labor could hold winter at the door. But no one else knew. And knowing, as Elias had learned, was not enough. Ruth Bell was the first outsider to feel the black house from inside. Her boy Peter had run off from the mercantile one afternoon in January and wandered toward the fen. I found him shivering near my drying racks, lost and frightened. I brought him inside, set him by the hearth, and gave him barley broth. Ruth arrived an hour later, frantic, and stopped in the doorway of the entry tunnel with her mouth open. "It feels like July," she said. She did not apologize for her husband. She did not call the bog cursed. She stood inside my peat walls with her son's boots steaming by the fire, and she did not say anything at all for a long time. When she left, she touched the wall the way I had, palm flat, testing, disbelieving. Word moved through North Ash Ferry the way it always does in small towns, quietly, through kitchens, after church, over fences. Ruth told the women told their husbands. Most of them shrugged. Some came to look, standing at a distance, unwilling to step onto the fen itself. A few asked to trade. I swapped dried peat bricks for flour, lamp oil, a good axe handle, and a pair of boots that fit. I never sold the method. I sold heat by the stack and gave advice free to anyone who asked without sneering. Then Silas Creed rode out. Creed was the grain agent and land speculator in North Ash Ferry. He wore a black coat year-round and carried a ledger the way some men carry a Bible, always open, always ready to record a debt. He wanted my land, not for what it could do, for what it cost. Tamarack Fen owed back taxes, and Creed had been waiting for me to fail so he could buy the parcel at auction and lease it for grazing. He arrived with a paper. He said my peat stacks constituted a fire hazard under county ordinance and that he was filing a formal complaint with the sheriff. He stood outside the black house and would not step onto the hummock. "A spark in this bog could smoke the whole county," he said. Orrin was sitting on a stone beside the entry tunnel. He pointed at the snow-melt trenches, the stone fire breaks, the clay-plastered chimney. "Show me the hazard, Silas," he said. "Point at it." Creed ignored him. He looked at me. "A ward boy does not hold land," he said. "He squats until men decide otherwise." "You do not fear fire, Mr. Creed," I said. "You fear taxes paid on time." He promised to return with the sheriff. He did not. But the threat sat in my chest like a stone for weeks, because Creed was right about one thing. I was a ward boy. I had no family. I had no standing. If a man with a ledger and a county connection decided my land should be his, the law was not built to stop him. Miss Eliza Harrow came in March. She was the school teacher in North Ash Ferry, a thin woman with ink-stained fingers and a habit of writing things down before she spoke about them. Ruth Bell had told her about the temperature, and Miss Harrow wanted to see the thermometer herself. She spent an hour inside the black house with a notebook of her own. She measured the walls, examined the hearth, read 3 of Elias's notebooks, and recorded the interior temperature at 4 different times of day. When she finished, she closed her notebook and said, "This is not witch work. This is patient observation applied over decades." She asked if she could write a pamphlet for the County Agricultural Society. I said yes. She asked if she could credit Elias by name. I said his name should go first. That spring, everyone's wells ran clear. Everyone's wood held. The winter of 1887 had been cold but ordinary, and people said my peat house was clever but unnecessary, a novelty, a swamp boy's trick. They had wood. They had walls. They were fine. They were fine until they were not. January 12th, 1888 started warm. I remember that because it frightened me. Warm in January in northern Minnesota is not a gift. It is a lie. The morning felt like late March. Snow slid off the roof of the black house in wet sheets. Children in town walked to school without their mittens tied tight. Men stood outside Bell's Mercantile with their coats open, joking about an early thaw. By noon, the sky to the northwest turned a color I had never seen before. Not gray, not black, something between them like coal smoke rolling low along the ground. The air went still in a way that made the hairs on my arms stand up. By 2 in the afternoon, the wind hit. It came from the northwest with a sound like tearing cloth, except the cloth was the sky and the tearing did not stop. Snow came sideways, so thick and so fast that I could not see the drying racks 30 feet from the door. The temperature dropped like something falling off a shelf. 1 hour, it was above freezing. The next hour, my thermometer read 8 degrees. By dark, it was below 0 and still falling. I sealed the entry tunnel and fed the hearth. The black house did what Elias had said it would do. 3 feet of peat held. The fire burned steady. The wind screamed across the fen and found nothing to grab. I sat inside and listened to the storm try to get in, and for the first time since I had arrived on this land, I was not afraid of winter, but I was afraid for everyone else. Ruth Bell came first. She arrived carrying her newborn under her shawl because their cabin wall whistled through every seam and the baby's lips had turned blue. Hiram followed 20 minutes later with Peter, half frozen, ashamed, unable to look at me. I did not make him look. I cleared a space by the hearth and told Ruth to hold the baby close to the warm wall. Orrin and I had strung a guide rope from the Black House to the road bend in October. His idea, not mine. He said a rope was cheaper than a funeral. Miss Harrow found that rope in the blinding white and came down it hand over hand with 5 schoolchildren behind her, each one gripping the coat of the child ahead. One boy was crying that his ears had gone numb. Miss Harrow's face was white with cold. I pulled them inside and shut the tunnel. 13 people in the Black House. The temperature dipped from 60 to 52 as the door opened and closed, then climbed back as the bodies and the hearth found their balance. I fed the fire 2 bricks every hour. Widow Klein came after dark. She appeared at the tunnel entrance, gray-faced and shaking, ice in her eyebrows, moving stiffly in the way people move when cold has gotten into their joints and will not leave. Her cabin stove had failed. Wind drove smoke back down the pipe until she could not breathe, and she had walked a mile through the storm with nothing but a shawl over her nightdress. Widow Klein, who had sent me away at age 12 for the sin of reading by candlelight, who had called my books wasteful and my curiosity disturbing, who had closed her door and returned me to the county ward without looking back. She stood in the entry tunnel and could not speak. Her mouth opened and nothing came out. "Come in," I said. I said it before she could ask. I said it before I could think about whether I wanted to say it, because Orrin was right about something he had told me once. He said, "Shut a person out in cold like this, and you do not punish them. You become them." 17 people now. I stacked more peat by the hearth. Near midnight, fists pounded on the tunnel door. Silas Creed. His hand was frostbitten, white and waxy, the fingers curled, and 2 hired men stood behind him, both shaking. The room held 17 people already. The walls held, the fire held. But I could feel the warmth dip each time the door opened, and 20 bodies in a 12 by 14 room is a calculation with limits. Orrin sat in the corner, wrapped in a blanket, watching me. He said quietly, "Let him in." I opened the door. Creed stepped inside. He looked at the thermometer on the wall, 62 degrees, and then at the 3-foot peat walls, and then at me. He did not thank me. He sat down on the floor near the hearth and held his ruined hand against the warm clay. 20 people, then 23 by morning, as 2 more families found the rope. The blizzard lasted 3 days. On the worst night, my thermometer outside read 39 degrees below zero. Inside, the hearth held 58. I burned peat bricks at a rate of 2 per hour, rotating stacks from the sheltered racks outside the tunnel. The walls never sweated. The chimney never failed. 23 people breathed inside a house made of the ground they had called worthless, while across the valley, wood cabins groaned and cracked and let the killing wind inside. They left in groups as the storm broke. Most said thank you. Some said nothing. Hiram Bell stopped at the tunnel entrance and turned back. He had a bundle under his arm. "Nails," he said, "for the door. I reckon win ought not win twice." I took the nails. The formal request began 3 days later. Widow Klein came first, standing outside with a flour sack. "I have no money for fuel," she said. I remembered her doorway. I remembered the cold that came after her door closed. I did not remind her of any of it. I filled the sack with dried peat bricks and showed her how to bank the fire so it would last through the night. Ruth Bell came for the baby. The Norquist family came for the children. 2 bachelors from the livery came for themselves. Then Creed's hired men. Then families I did not know by name, sent from homesteads I had never visited. A line formed on the path to the hummock, and I kept a chalk count on the inner wall of the Black House. Each mark was a sack of peat given away. The practical tension was real. My stacks were shrinking. If I gave too freely, the black house itself would run cold before thaw. I measured what remained and calculated weeks. I had enough for the house and enough to give, but not enough for both if March came late. Orrin watched the marks on the wall multiply. One evening, after I had carried 6 sacks to waiting families, he said, "Some of those people did not deserve your door." I was stacking bricks by the hearth. I did not look up. "Maybe they do not deserve it," I said, "but cold does not ask who laughed first." Creed never came himself after the blizzard. He sent a boy for his Peat. When I saw Creed in town 2 weeks later, he was standing outside the mercantile with his frost-bitten hand bandaged. He looked at me and said, "This does not make you a gentleman." "No," I said, "it makes you warm." I carried Peat to Agnes Pike's inspection wagon when her driver's hands went numb on the road outside North Ash Ferry. I recognized her before she recognized me. She was bundled in a county blanket, smaller than I remembered, and when I set the sack of bricks on the wagon bed, she looked at my face and went very still. "Caleb," she said. "Mrs. Pike," I said. I did not say anything else. I did not need to. The Peat spoke louder than I could. "Naistam." Agnes Pike returned officially in February with 2 county men and Miss Harrow's temperature logs. She expected disorder. She found a clean, plastered room with labeled peat stacks, organized drying racks, a stone hearth that drew perfectly, and the thermometer on the wall still reading 56 degrees. She asked to see the notebooks. I gave her all 16. She read for an hour while the county men measured the walls and scratched notes on their clipboards. When she reached the envelope, the one addressed to me, her face changed. She set it down and pressed her hands together in her lap, the way people do when they're trying to hold something inside. "I received letters from Elias Voss," she said. The room went quiet. Orrin looked up from his corner. Miss Harrow stopped writing. "How many?" I asked. 3. Her voice was thin. "He wrote 3 times asking the county ward to send you to him after your mother died. He said he had land and work and that a boy should not grow up in an institution when family remained." "What did you do with them?" I asked. "I marked him unfit relation," she said, "because the town called him mad, because sending a child to a swamp would have embarrassed the board, because it was easier to file a letter than to test whether a man in a bog had something to offer." I stood there and felt the heat of the room Elias had imagined and I had built, and I thought of the years between his letters and this moment, the 3 homes that sent me back, the county ward, the nights on frozen dirt, the first winter when I nearly walked away. "I forgive you, Mrs. Pike," I said, "not because the letters do not matter, because I will not live in the drawer where you left them." She did not cry. She nodded once. She stood, and she left. The county men stayed long enough to record that the structure met no existing code and violated no existing ordinance. Miss Harrow presented my logs and Elias's notebooks to the County Agricultural Society that spring. Elias Ward Voss was credited by name. His first notebook was placed under glass at the North Ash Ferry schoolhouse, beside a dried peat brick and the hand-drawn map of Tamarack Fen. Orrin died in late February of 1889. I found him in his chair beside the hearth of the black house, one hand resting on the plumb line he carried, everywhere, the other in his lap. A bowl of barley broth sat beside him, still warm. He looked like a man who had decided to rest for a moment and discovered that rest, at 72, does not always give you back. I buried him on the hummock above the bog, on the highest ground, where the tamaracks grew. I dug the grave myself in frozen soil that fought me for every inch. I placed the plumb line in his coat pocket because his hands looked wrong without it. I planted 3 tamarack seedlings over the grave. Hiram Bell said trees hated that ground. 2 of the 3 lived. Orrin left his tools, his cabin site on the freight road, and a letter. The letter said, "Teach before you grow hard. A man who keeps warmth to himself has missed the point of building walls." I married Anna Soren in 1892. She was Ruth Bell's younger cousin. She came to the Fen one spring to see the Black House, and she was the first person who asked to read the notebooks before asking what they were worth. We were married in the North Ash Ferry Church. Hiram Bell came. Silas Creed did not. We had 3 children. I will not name them here because this story is about a swamp and a dead man's notebooks, not about the ordinary, beautiful business of raising a family. By 1895, 5 peat storm rooms stood in the township. By 1900, I taught winter building classes after harvest in the schoolhouse where Elias's notebook sat under glass. Miss Harrow's pamphlet was reprinted twice and traveled to 2 county fairs. I never became rich. I never wanted to. I wanted what Elias had wanted, for the thing that looked dead to prove it was holding fire. My hands grew bent with the years. My knees never forgave the bog water. But I could judge a peat brick's readiness by its sound until the day my ears stopped being reliable, and even then I could feel the difference in the weight. My hands knew that fen the way a blind man knows his own kitchen. I died on an April morning in 1931. It was a Tuesday. The thaw had started early that year, and I had gone outside to press my palm against the old south wall of the Black House, the way I did every spring, to feel the warmth still holding inside after 45 winters. My daughter Mara found me sitting against the wall with my hand flat on the clay. She said later, "He looked like he was measuring one last spring." The Black House stood for another 30 years after that. The peat stacks outlasted me. The hearth Orrin built never cracked, and every winter someone lit a fire inside those 3-foot walls and felt the warmth Elias Voss had promised was there, decades before anyone believed him. What looks dead in summer may be holding winter's fire. He wrote that in a notebook wrapped in oilcloth, hidden in a bench in a collapsed shack on a piece of ground the town called Voss's drowning mattress. He wrote it for a grandson he was not allowed to meet. And on a January night when the wind hit 39 below and 23 people huddled inside walls made of the swamp everyone had mocked, that line stopped being a theory and became the truest sentence anyone in Roseau County had ever written. Agnes Pike said I had inherited land not fit for a grave. She was wrong. It was not a grave. It was a hearth. And the man who built it never saw it finished, but he saw it clearly enough to draw the plans, and he believed in me enough to wrap them in oilcloth against the damp. Elias's first notebook still sits under glass in the North Ash Ferry schoolhouse. Beside it, a single black peat brick. Beside that, a card in Miss Harrow's handwriting. Elias Ward Voss. 23 years of patient observation. Caleb Ansel Voss. 45 years of proof. So let me ask you something. What swamp are you standing in? What piece of ground has someone told you is worthless, not worth your time, not worth your back, not worth the years it would take to find out whether they were right? What did someone say about the thing you inherited? Not money, not land, maybe just a way of seeing, a stubbornness, a question you cannot stop asking, that made you believe it was a joke. Maybe you were told you came from nothing. Maybe you were told the thing you care about is impractical or strange or too small to matter. Maybe someone with authority and a black dress and a permanent expression of mild disgust looked you in the eye and said your inheritance was not fit for a grave. I'm here to tell you that the surface is the least interesting part of any piece of ground and of any human being. Elias spent 23 years measuring a swamp that the entire county called a drowning mattress, and he found winter's fire inside it. He did not need the town to believe him. He needed one person stubborn enough to finish the wall. I was that person. Not because I was smart, not because I was brave, because I had nowhere else to go, and the notebooks assumed me. And I decided that a dead man's faith was worth more than a living town's laughter. The conditions do not have to be perfect. They almost never are. I built a house with cracked hands and a stolen primer and 42 cents. I heated it with ground everyone said was dead. And when the worst storm in 50 years came screaming across that fen, the dead ground held. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about the swamp you have been told to abandon, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who built extraordinary things in the places everyone else had given up on. Your swamp is not empty. Cut one brick.